She was just a waitress in a dusty western town, or so everyone believed. But when a ruthless cattle baron tried to buy her, he never expected her to stand her ground and teach him the true meaning of dignity. What followed wasn't just a battle of power, but a transformation of the human soul. Let's begin with us.
The wealthiest man in Montana Territory walked into the dusty saloon. He dropped a gold eagle coin on the counter. He decided right then and there he was going to buy the waitress. He just didn't know she was the one woman in the West who couldn't be bought. It was a Friday night in 1882, Miles City, payday for the Ridge Riders. The air inside the Silver Dollar Saloon was thick. It smelled like cheap whiskey, unwashed wool, and bad intentions. Mara Elspeth Voss wiped down a sticky table. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She knew the rhythm of this place. She was 29, an orphaned minister's daughter, stranded 1,000 miles from Boston. She worked 14-hour shifts, saving every dime, waiting for the day she could buy a train ticket out of this dirt-stained purgatory. Across the room, the piano stopped. That was always the first sign. The silence. A chair shattered against the floorboards. 2 ranch hands were on their feet. One was a white drifter. The other was a Mexican vaquero. Both were drunk. Both had their knives out. The steel caught the dim light of the oil lamps. A Lakota trader, just trying to enjoy his drink, was caught right between them. The bartender ducked under the counter. The rest of the room stepped back. Tensions in the territory were a powder keg. All it took was one spark. One wrong word. Mara didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked right into the center of the circle. She didn't yell, she just spoke, calm, steady, like she was reading a weather report. First, she looked at the vaquero. She spoke in rapid, flawless Spanish. She didn't threaten him. She simply reminded him that his boss was strict, that a knife fight meant no wages this month, that his mother back in Sonora needed that money. The vaquero blinked. The anger in his eyes flickered. He lowered his blade. Then Mara turned to the Lakota trader. She switched languages seamlessly, spoke his native tongue, soft, respectful. She told him the back door was clear, that there was no honor in dying over a drunk man's spilled beer. The trader nodded once. He gathered his coat. He slipped out into the night. The spark died. The powder keg fizzled out. The piano player, shaking slightly, started plucking the keys again. Mara picked up her rag. She went back to wiping the table. From a dark corner booth, Callum Dunn watched her. Callum was 38. He was a hard man, the biggest cattle baron in the territory. He wore a tailored wool coat and a permanent cynical scowl. He solved his problems with a checkbook. Or a gun. Usually the checkbook. It was cleaner. He trusted no one. He believed in nothing. But right now he had a massive problem. A railroad company was trying to steal his land. They were using legal loopholes, burying him in paperwork. He needed someone who could read complex contracts. He also needed someone who could negotiate with the local tribes holding the land borders. Most importantly, he needed someone who didn't flinch. He looked at the waitress in the stained apron. Callum raised a hand. He gestured for her to come over, a short, sharp motion, a command. Mara saw him. She finished wiping the table. She took her time. Then she walked over. She didn't smile. She held her serving tray against her chest, like a shield. "What can I get you?" she asked. Her voice was flat, tired. Callum didn't ask for her name. He didn't offer his. He reached inside his heavy coat. He pulled out a thick stack of greenbacks. He tossed them onto the wet, scarred wood of the table between them. "What do you make in this dump?" Callum asked. His voice was gravel and smoke. $1 a week? 2? Mara looked at the money. Then she looked at him. "I do, all right." "I'll pay 10 times that," Callum said. He leaned back in his chair. Arrogant, completely sure of himself. "Pack your bags tonight. Tomorrow, you belong to my ranch. You translate for me. You keep my books. You handle the railroad lawyers." Mara didn't move. She didn't reach for the cash. "I'm not for sale, mister." Callum smirked. A cold, hollow thing. He leaned forward. He tapped the stack of bills with one calloused finger. "Don't play hard to get," he said. "Out here in Montana, everyone has a number. Every man, every woman. We all have a price tag. You just have to be honest about yours. So tell me, what is your price, sweetheart?" Mara didn't blink. She stood up a little taller. The exhaustion in her shoulders vanished. When she spoke, she didn't whisper. She let her voice carry, clear as a bell over the noise of the saloon. "My price is basic human decency, sir," Mara said. Callum's smirk froze. "I will spell it out for you since you seem confused," Mara continued. Her tone was razor sharp. "A person's value is not determined by their social class. It is not determined by their gender, and it is certainly not determined by the size of their bank account. Every human being is born with dignity, and dignity cannot be bought." Callum stared at her. Nobody talked to him like this, ever. "You can buy my labor," Mara said. "You can pay for my time, but you cannot buy my right to be treated like a human being. Equality isn't a commodity you purchase. It is a respect you practice. If you want a worker, offer me a fair contract. If you want an obedient slave you can throw money at, go buy a dog. So keep your cash, mister. I'll keep my pride." She didn't wait for his answer. She turned around. She walked away, back to the bar, back to work. Silence hit Callum's table, heavy, absolute. Callum Dunn, the man who owned half the territory, had absolutely nothing to say. He sat there for a long time. He looked at the stack of money. It looked incredibly small suddenly, useless. He looked at the woman wiping down the bar. He stood up. He pocketed his money. He adjusted his hat. And he walked out into the cold night air. Mara didn't watch him leave. She assumed he was gone for good. Just another arrogant cowboy with too much money and too little sense. But the next morning, when the sun first broke over the eastern ridge, turning the sky the color of bruised peaches, Callum Dunn was waiting outside her boarding house. He wasn't holding cash this time. He was holding a piece of paper, a fair, meticulously written, legally binding employment contract. Mara stepped off the porch. She looked at the paper. Then she looked at him. Callum took his hat off, a gesture of respect. "I need you," he said. His voice was quiet. The arrogance was gone, washed away by the truth she had handed him the night before. "And I will learn to respect you." The wagon ride out of Miles City took 4 hours. It was a quiet trip. The Montana sky was impossibly huge, a pale, bruised blue stretching out over endless miles of dry grass. The wind kicked up dust. It bit at Mara's cheeks. She didn't complain. She held her single battered leather suitcase on her lap. She watched the land roll by. Callum Dunn drove the team. He sat rigid, broad shoulders blocking the sun. He didn't speak, not to point out landmarks, not to make small talk. He just drove. When they crossed the property line, Mara felt it. The atmosphere shifted. The Dunn Ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was a fortress, miles of taut, cruel barbed wire, thick wooden posts driven deep into the hard earth. The main house sat on a rise. It was a massive structure of river stone and dark timber. It was rich, it was imposing, and it was completely devoid of life. There were no flowers near the porch, no rocking chairs, no signs of comfort. It was a machine built for making money. It matched the man holding the reins perfectly. Callum pulled the wagon to a halt. He tied off the horses. He didn't offer a hand to help her down. Mara didn't need one anyway. She stepped down into the dust. "Your room is off the kitchen," Callum said. His voice was flat. "Business." "The office is down the hall. I expect you at the ledgers by noon. We have a railroad trying to run tracks through my south pasture. I need to know exactly how much capital we have to fight them in federal court." He turned and walked toward the barn. Mara stood there for a moment. She looked at the massive stone house. She took a deep breath. She went inside. The office was dark. It smelled of old leather, stale tobacco, and dust. The mahogany desk was massive. It was buried under a mountain of chaotic paperwork, receipts, deeds, survey maps. Mara tied her apron on. She sat down. She went to work. She spent 3 days untangling the mess. She was fast. She was precise. Her mind worked like a steel trap. By the evening of the 3rd day, she understood Callum Dunn better than he understood himself. The numbers told a story. He was rich, ridiculously rich, but he was bleeding money. She traced a finger down a column of expenses. She frowned. He was paying 3 times the going rate for security. He had hired guns patrolling his fence lines, dozens of them, not cattle rustlers, mercenaries. Why? What was he guarding? Or who was he trying to keep out? The heavy oak door swung open. It hit the wall with a dull thud. Callum walked in. His boots were caked with fresh mud. He looked tired. He looked angry. The railroad men had been surveying near the ridge all day. It was putting him on edge. He didn't knock. He didn't say hello. He just walked to the desk and slapped a leather glove down on her neat pile of papers. "I need the final tally," Callum barked. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the paper. "And when you're done with that, go out to the bunkhouse. Tell the foreman to double the night watch. Then get back to the kitchen and fix my supper. Move." Mara stopped writing. She set her pen down, carefully, deliberately. She didn't look at the glove. She looked at him. The silence stretched. It was the same kind of silence from the Silver Dollar Saloon, the kind right before a glass breaks. Callum finally looked up. His eyes narrowed. "Did you not hear me, girl?" Mara stood up. She wasn't tall, but in that moment she seemed to take up the entire room. She placed both hands flat on the mahogany desk. She held his gaze, unblinking, unafraid. "Mr. Dunn," Mara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "Let me make this perfectly clear, right here, right now." Callum frowned. He opened his mouth to speak. She cut him off. "An employment contract is not a bill of sale," Mara stated. Her words hit like hammer strikes, sharp, absolute. "I am your bookkeeper. I am your translator. I am not your servant, and I am certainly not your property." Callum stood frozen, his jaw locked. "Women in this territory work just as hard as the men," Mara continued, leaning forward slightly. "We offer our intellect, we offer our labor, and we deserve to be spoken to as equals. We are not mules to be barked at. We are partners in the survival of this harsh land." She picked up his muddy leather glove. She held it out to him. "If you want someone to fetch your boots and take your orders without question, you hired the wrong woman," Mara said. Her voice didn't shake. "But if you want a partner with the intellect to help you keep this land from being stolen by a railroad corporation, then you need to change your tone. True strength isn't barking orders at people beneath you. True strength is recognizing the dignity in the people standing right in front of you." She dropped the glove. It hit the desk with a soft slap. "Now, which one of us are we going to be?" Callum stared at her. His chest rose and fell. A heavy, angry breath. The muscles in his neck were tight like coiled wire. He was the king of his world. Men trembled when he raised his voice. But this woman in a faded cotton dress had just gutted his pride with a few sentences. He wanted to yell. He wanted to fire her. But he looked at the perfectly organized ledgers. He looked at the steady, fearless fire in her eyes. And for the first time in his life, Callum Dunn felt something entirely unfamiliar. Respect. He didn't say a word. He picked up his glove. He turned around and walked over to the small iron stove in the corner of the office. A pot of coffee was sitting on the hot iron. Callum picked up a clean porcelain cup. He poured the coffee. Black. Steaming. He walked back to the desk. He set the cup down next to her inkwell. He didn't look her in the eye, but his hand lingered on the edge of the desk for a fraction of a second. "The tally," Callum said. His voice was lower now. The bark was gone. "I need the tally by tonight, please." Mara looked at the coffee. Then she looked at him. "You will have it in an hour," she said softly. Callum nodded once. He turned and walked out of the room. He closed the door quietly behind him. Mara sat back down. She picked up her pen. The coffee was bitter, strong, and exactly how she liked it. The war wasn't won, but the ground had shifted. They were no longer master and employee. They were standing on the same earth. Late fall arrived with teeth. The wind off the mountains turned sharp. It carried the scent of pine, of frost, of coming snow. The tall prairie grass turned brittle and white in the mornings. Mara needed a break. The ledgers were a battlefield. The railroad company, Northern Pacific, was aggressive. Harrison Aldgate, their lead agent, was burying them in injunctions. Mara had been reading legal precedents for 3 days straight. Her eyes burned. Her head ached. She grabbed her thick wool shawl. She stepped out the back door of the kitchen. She walked. She needed to feel the ground beneath her feet. She needed to remember there was a world outside of ink and paper. She wandered past the massive horse stables, past the blacksmith's forge. She headed toward the far eastern boundary of the home compound, the part Callum never visited. The wind shifted. Mara stopped. She frowned. She closed her eyes and breathed in. The air here was different. It didn't smell like dry grass and frost. It smelled damp, heavy, unnatural, like turned earth that had never quite settled. It smelled like a wound that had healed wrong. She opened her eyes and walked toward the scent. Behind a grove of dying cottonwood trees, the land dipped into a shallow hollow. It was surrounded by a tight, aggressive perimeter of barbed wire. Inside the wire there was an old foundation. Large, jagged stones. The remains of a building that had been torn down. Not burned. Deliberately dismantled. Mara stood at the wire. She looked at the dark, sinking soil inside the foundation. A cold shiver ran down her spine. It had nothing to do with the wind. The earth never forgets. Mara jumped. She spun around. An older indigenous man stood a few yards away. He was on the outside of the ranch's property line. He wore a heavy wool blanket over a canvas coat. His hair was streaked with gray. His face was a map of deep lines. He stood incredibly still, like a tree rooted to the spot. It was Chief Standing Bear. Mara had seen him in town once, but never out here. "I'm sorry," Mara said, catching her breath. "You startled me." Standing Bear didn't smile, but his eyes were not unkind. He looked past her. He looked at the fenced-off foundation. "That ground is sick," the chief said. His voice was deep, resonant. "He put wire around it, as if iron teeth can keep ghosts from walking." Mara stepped closer to the fence line, separating them. "Who? Mr. Dunn?" Standing Bear looked at her. He studied her face. "You are the new woman who reads the papers, the one he bought." "He didn't buy me," Mara said firmly. "I work for him, by choice." "A bird in a golden cage still belongs to the man with the key," the chief replied softly. "No," Mara insisted. She gripped the shawl tight around her shoulders. "I own my own life. Mr. Dunn and I have a contract of equals. I demanded his respect, and he gave it." Standing Bear tilted his head. A slow, sad knowing filled his eyes. "You speak of respect and equality," Standing Bear said. His words carried the weight of a sermon. "But look around you, child. White men think paying money buys the land. They draw lines on paper. They put up wire. They say, 'This is mine.' But the land belongs to no one. We belong to the land." Mara listened. The wind seemed to quiet down around them. "A man's goodness is not measured by the size of his ranch," Standing Bear continued, his voice rising clearly. "It is not measured by the gold in his bank or the legal contracts in his desk. A true measure of a man is how he treats the vulnerable, how he honors the weak. If he crushes others to build his empire, his wealth is just a monument to his own cruelty." He pointed a weathered finger at the dark soil inside the foundation. Be careful of a man trying to use money to pave over his past, young woman. A man who hides his sins under the earth will eventually be swallowed by them. True justice demands truth, not silence. You cannot buy a clear conscience. Mara stared at the dark earth. Then she looked back at the chief. "What happened here?" she whispered. "What is he hiding?" Before Standing Bear could answer, the thunder of hooves shattered the quiet. Mara whipped around. Callum was riding hard. He was on his massive black gelding. He was coming straight for them. He wasn't riding for a casual patrol. He was riding like a man at war. He pulled the horse up hard. The animal reared, kicking up a cloud of freezing dust. "Get away from there!" Callum roared. He wasn't yelling at Mara. He was glaring directly at Standing Bear. Callum swung down from the saddle. He didn't bother tying the reins. He stalked toward the fence line. His face was pale. His eyes were wild. The calm, arrogant Baron was gone. This man looked unhinged. "I told you never to come back here," Callum shouted, his voice cracking like a whip. "This is my land. I hold the deed. Get off my property line, old man, before I have the marshals drag you away." Standing Bear didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He just looked at Callum. It was a look of profound, crushing pity. "You can own the paper, Callum Dunn," Standing Bear said quietly. "But you cannot own the blood underneath it." The chief turned. He pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. He walked away, slow, dignified, undefeated. Callum stood at the fence line. His hands were gripping the barbed wire. The metal barbs bit into his leather gloves. He was breathing hard. Ragged, desperate gasps. Mara watched him. 10 minutes ago, she would have thought he was just a hateful, territorial tyrant. But she looked closer. She saw his knuckles turning white. She saw the slight tremble in his broad shoulders. She saw the way he refused to look at the dark earth behind him. He wasn't shouting out of hate. He was shouting out of terror. "Callum?" Mara said softly. He flinched, like she had struck him. He let go of the wire. He didn't turn around to face her. "Go back to the house, Mara," he said. His voice was hollow, empty. "Callum? What is under there?" she asked. She stepped toward him. What did he mean by blood? "I said go back to the house," he snapped. He finally turned. His eyes were desperate, pleading and furious all at once. "Do your job. Balance the books. Fight the railroad. But do not ever ask me about this piece of dirt again. Do you understand me?" Mara stood her ground. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She didn't argue. She didn't push. She just looked at him. She saw a man drowning in his own armor. "I'll go back to the house," Mara said evenly. "But secrets are like seeds, Mr. Dunn. Eventually, the rain comes, and everything buried finds its way back to the light." She turned and walked back toward the stone fortress. Callum stayed by the wire, alone with the damp earth, alone with the ghosts he was paying a fortune to keep quiet. Winter didn't arrive with a whisper. It came with a scream. It started as a freezing rain. It fell for 3 days straight. The ground was already hard. It couldn't drink the water fast enough. Powder Creek swelled. The water turned brown. It turned violent. It tore at the riverbanks. It chewed through the roots of the ancient pines. Mara tied a rope around her waist. She secured the other end to the porch rail. The wind was deafening. It sounded like a freight train rolling right through the valley. She pulled her wool hat down over her ears. She leaned into the gale. She had to get to the barn. The horses were panicking. She waded through mud that sucked at her boots. Freezing rain lashed her face like shattered glass. Halfway across the yard, she saw him. Callum. He wasn't at the barn. He was standing on the ridge near the eastern boundary. He was staring down at the hollow. The barbed wire was gone, swept away. The ground beneath the old foundation had given way. The floodwaters from the creek had undercut the bank. The earth had collapsed. A massive mudslide had ripped the topsoil right off the hill. Mara undid her rope. She fought her way up the ridge. Her lungs burned, her legs ached. She reached the crest. She looked down, and the breath left her body. The mudslide hadn't just moved dirt, it had opened a grave. Beneath the ruined foundation, a massive hidden cellar had been ripped open. The wooden ceiling beams were snapped like twigs, and inside the pit, washed pale by the driving rain, was a mountain of bone. Hundreds of them. Skulls, rib cages, femurs. They weren't human, they were livestock. Cattle, horses, sheep. A massive herd, slaughtered and dumped into a mass grave, then buried beneath a heavy stone foundation to hide the evidence. Mara stood frozen. The rain pounded against her back. Callum was already down in the hollow. He was knee-deep in the freezing mud. He wasn't arrogant right now. He wasn't a baron. He looked like a man who had just watched the gates of hell swing open. Mara scrambled down the slippery bank. She slid the last few feet, landing in the muck beside him. "Callum!" she shouted over the storm. "What is this?" He didn't look at her. He stared at the bones. His massive chest heaved. His hands hung useless at his sides. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead. "Callum!" she yelled again. She grabbed his arm. It was like grabbing a block of ice. "Whose animals are these?" He finally turned his head. His eyes were shattered. The pride, the coldness, the cynical armor, all of it was gone, stripped away by the water and the earth. "Standing bears," Callum whispered. His voice was completely hollow. It barely carried over the wind. But Mara heard it. He fell to his knees, right there in the freezing mud. He didn't care about the cold. He didn't care about his dignity. He pressed his face into his muddy hands. His broad shoulders shook. Mara knelt down beside him. The freezing mud soaked right through her skirt. She didn't care. She waited. She knew the truth was coming. It had been buried for 4 years. It couldn't be held back anymore. "It was 1878, Callum said. His voice was broken. A jagged, bleeding thing. "I was a translator for the army. Colonel Reeves. He wanted this valley. He wanted the grazing land. But the Nakota were here. Standing Bear's people. They had a treaty." Callum dropped his hands. He stared at the pale skulls in the mud. "Reeves didn't care about the treaty," Callum continued. The words poured out, a poisoned river finally draining. "He waited until the men went on a late hunt. He took his soldiers. They rounded up the entire herd, every cow, every horse. They slaughtered them all, dumped them in this ravine. They starved the tribe out, forced them onto the reservation." Mara felt sick. A cold, heavy stone formed in her stomach. "And you?" she asked. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. "What did you do?" Callum looked at her. His eyes were filled with absolute, crushing self-hatred. "I took the money," he said. The confession tore at his throat. "Reeves paid me triple my wages to keep my mouth shut. I took the blood money. I bought this land when he moved on. I built a fortress. I built an empire. I thought if I got rich enough, if I got powerful enough, I could prove that the world was just cruel, that caring was a weakness." He grabbed a handful of the muddy earth. He squeezed it until his knuckles turned white. "I bought the land to guard the bones," Callum choked out. "I thought if I punished myself every day, if I stayed alone, if I hated myself enough, it would pay the debt. I locked my heart up. I thought my guilt was a noble sacrifice." Mara listened. The wind howled around them. The rain beat down on the graves of 100 stolen futures. She didn't pity him. Pity was useless. Pity didn't change the world. She reached out. She grabbed his chin. She forced him to look her in the eye. "Listen to me, Callum Dunn," Mara said. Her voice cut through the storm. It was sharp. It was clear. It carried the absolute weight of a sermon. "Solitary torment isn't redemption," Mara declared. She didn't blink. "You think freezing your own heart is a noble punishment? You think sitting in the dark and hating yourself balances the scales of justice? It doesn't. Guilt is just another form of selfishness if it doesn't lead to action." Callum stared at her. His breath hitched. True atonement requires courage, Mara stated firmly, her words ringing with undeniable educational truth. It begins when you stop hiding. You must speak the truth in the light. It is not enough to feel bad about the past. You have to use your power, your wealth, and your voice to protect the oppressed today. You don't honor the victims of injustice by burying yourself in the dirt with them. You honor them by standing up and fighting the systems that allowed it to happen. Justice is an action, not an emotion. Callum let out a ragged breath. The words struck him like physical blows. They shattered the last remaining pieces of his arrogant shell. He had been hiding for 4 long years. He looked at Mara. He looked at the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. She wasn't just a bookkeeper. She wasn't just a woman he hired. She was his conscience, brought to life. He reached out. His large, trembling, muddy hand closed over hers. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He squeezed her hand. A promise. They stood up together in the pouring rain. They left the bones exposed to the sky. Let the earth breathe. It was time to stop hiding. January brought the white death. The snow started on a Tuesday. It fell fine and hard like crushed glass. By Thursday, the world outside the stone house was gone. There were no fences, there were no trees, just a howling, blinding white wall. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero. Inside the house was a fortress. Callum had built it thick. The massive stone hearth in the center of the main room burned hot. Callum and Mara were trapped inside. The silence between them was different now. The hostility was gone. The arrogance had been washed away by the mudslide. What remained was a quiet, cautious rebuilding, like a forest after a wildfire. It was near midnight on Friday. The wind was shrieking against the window panes. Then they heard it, a sound, faint, irregular, not the wind. Thump, thump. Callum stood up from his chair. He didn't hesitate. He strode to the heavy oak door. He threw the bolt. The wind blasted the door open, nearly knocking him off his feet. A wave of freezing white powder swept into the hallway. Callum reached into the darkness. He pulled something inside. He slammed the door shut. He threw the bolt. He dropped to his knees on the rug. It was a boy, maybe 10 years old. He was wearing a thin canvas coat that was frozen stiff. His lips were blue. His eyes were rolled back. He was holding a dead lantern in his frostbitten hand. It was Theo, an orphan who swept the floors at the general store in town. He must have gotten caught in the storm trying to check traps on the ridge. He was dying. He had minutes left. The old Callum would have panicked. He would have thrown a blanket over the boy, paced the room, and thought about how much money it would take to hire a doctor he couldn't reach. This Callum didn't think about money. "Mara, blankets, now!" Callum shouted. He didn't wait. He stripped off his own heavy wool sweater. He tore the frozen canvas coat off the boy. Theo's skin was like ice. Callum sat down on the rug, right in front of the roaring fire. He pulled the freezing, unconscious boy directly against his own bare chest. He wrapped his large, muscular arms around the frail child. He used his own body heat. He became a human furnace. Mara ran into the room with an armful of thick wool blankets. She threw them over both of them, tucking the edges tight, sealing the heat in. She knelt beside them. She watched Callum's face. His jaw was tight. His eyes were fiercely focused on the boy. He was rocking slightly, pouring his own life force into the child. "Come on," Callum whispered. His voice was rough. "Don't you quit. Come on." It took an hour of absolute silence, save for the crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. Finally, Theo took a deep, shuddering breath. He coughed. His blue lips slowly began to turn pink. Callum closed his eyes. A profound look of relief washed over his scarred face. He held the boy closer. Over the next week, the storm raged on. But inside the house, a family began to form, without contracts, without money changing hands. Callum changed. The shift was absolute. He didn't bark orders. He didn't lock himself in his office. He sat on the floor and carved a wooden horse for Theo. He helped Mara peel potatoes in the kitchen. And then there was the desk. On the fourth day of the blizzard, Mara walked into the office. She stopped in her tracks. Her heavy flat chair was gone. Her low ledger table was gone. In their place was a beautiful custom-built standing desk. It was made of rich, polished oak. It was angled perfectly. It was exactly the right height for her. She realized then what Callum had been doing in the woodshed for the past 2 days. He had noticed her rubbing her lower back. He had noticed the pain she tried to hide from hunching over the books. He hadn't bought her a new desk. He hadn't thrown money at a catalog. He had built it with his own 2 hands. It was the most profound apology and the most profound promise she had ever seen. That evening, the fire was burning low. Callum was in the kitchen, fetching more firewood. Theo sat on the rug, wrapped in a blanket, playing with the wooden horse. Mara sat in the armchair, mending a torn shirt. Theo looked up. His young eyes were serious. Too serious for a boy his age. "Miss Mara?" Theo asked quietly. "Yes, Theo." "Mr. Dunn is the richest man in the territory," the boy said. "Everybody in town says so. They say he has more money than God." "He has a lot of money, yes," Mara agreed softly. "Then why did he always look so sad in town?" Theo asked. "Before the storm. When I saw him at the store, he looked like the poorest man I ever saw. He looked like a ghost. Why didn't his money make him happy?" Mara stopped her sewing. She looked at the young boy. She knew this was a moment that mattered. She set her needle down. "Because money is just a tool, Theo," Mara explained. She spoke clearly, making sure the boy understood every single word. The educational value of her lesson hung heavy in the warm air. "Money can buy lumber and nails," Mara said, looking directly into the boy's eyes. "It can build a massive house to keep the wind out. But money cannot build a home. A home is built on care, on trust, on looking out for someone other than yourself." Theo listened intently. "Compassion cannot be bought with silver," Mara continued, her voice steady and resolute. "You cannot purchase human connection. True wealth is not found in a bank vault. It is forged in the moments we choose to stand by each other when the storm hits. It is found in giving your own warmth to save a freezing child. A man can own 1,000,000 acres, Theo, but if he refuses to love his neighbor, he will die a beggar in his own heart." In the hallway, hidden in the shadows, Callum stood perfectly still. He held an armful of firewood. He didn't make a sound. He heard every single word Mara said. He let them wash over him. He let them settle deep into his bones. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had held a dying boy, the hands that had built a desk for a woman he respected. He wasn't a baron anymore. He wasn't a ghost. For the first time in his adult life, Callum Dunn felt like a rich man. Spring didn't arrive. It fought its way in. It started with a sound, a sharp, echoing crack, like a rifle shot ringing out across the valley. It was the ice on Powder Creek breaking apart. Then came the dripping, the endless, rhythmic sound of melting snow sliding off the heavy eaves of the stone house. It was the sound of survival. They had made it through the White Death. The valley turned into an ocean of mud. The prairie grass pushed up green and fierce. Theo was thriving. The hollow-eyed boy from the storm was gone. He had color in his cheeks. He helped Callum mend the fences. He sat at the new oak standing desk and let Mara teach him how to read the ledgers. Callum was different, too. The cold, untouchable Baron was dead, buried beneath the mudslide. The man who walked the ranch now was quiet, but his eyes were alive. He listened. He watched. He treated his ranch hands with a firm, quiet respect. Then the mud dried. The roads cleared, and the real threat arrived. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky was painfully clear. Mara was on the porch, shaking out a rug. She heard them before she saw them. The heavy, synchronized thud of matched carriage horses. A sleek black buggy rolled up the long drive. 4 men rode on horseback behind it. Surveyors, carrying heavy brass transits and rolls of mapping paper. The buggy stopped. A man stepped out. He didn't wear a Stetson or heavy boots. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white collar, a silk tie. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. He looked completely out of place against the raw, bleeding edge of the frontier. It was Harrison Aldgate, lead agent for the Northern Pacific Railroad. Callum walked out from the barn. He wiped grease from his hands with an old rag. He didn't hurry. He walked with a heavy, grounded stride. Mara set the rug down. She stood on the porch, her spine straight. Aldgate smiled. It was a practiced, bloodless thing. A smile that had stolen 1,000 acres before breakfast. "Mr. Dunn," Aldgate said. His voice was smooth, cultured. "A pleasure to finally meet the man behind the legendary stubbornness. I am Harrison Aldgate." Callum didn't offer his hand. He just looked at the man's polished boots. "You're trespassing, Aldgate," Callum said. Short, flat. Aldgate chuckled. He reached into his tailored jacket. He pulled out a thick envelope. He held it out. "Actually, Mr. Dunn, I am executing a federal mandate," Aldgate replied. "The railroad has been granted right-of-way through the southern corridor. Your deed is, well, it's contested. We believe there are irregularities in your original claim. We are here to survey the line." Callum didn't take the envelope. Mara walked down the porch steps. She walked right up to Aldgate. She took the envelope from his hand. She opened it. She scanned the dense legal text. Her eyes darted back and forth. Aldgate watched her. His smile faltered slightly. He wasn't used to women reading legal mandates. "There are no irregularities in the claim," Mara said. She looked up. Her voice was pure ice. "The Homestead Act of '62 requires improvements. Mr. Dunn has built a permanent structure, fenced the perimeter, sunk a well. Your claim of eminent domain is premature, and this injunction is filed in a district court that doesn't have jurisdiction over this specific county line." Aldgate stared at her. He blinked. Once, twice. He looked at Callum. "And who is this?" "My equal," Callum said. He didn't blink. "And my legal representative. You speak to her." Aldgate's jaw tightened, just a fraction. The polished veneer cracked, revealing the predator beneath. "Very well," Aldgate said. "We will survey the boundary line today. We will not cross the fence, but be warned. We have the capital, the lawyers, and the time. You will sell, Mr. Dunn. The only question is how little we pay you when the court finally breaks you." He turned on his heel. He signaled his men. They began setting up their tripods along the property line. Callum went back to the barn. He trusted Mara to watch them. An hour passed. Mara stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the brass instruments flash in the sun. Aldgate walked away from his men. He approached the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at Mara. "You are a very articulate woman," Aldgate said quietly. "Too articulate to be playing house on a doomed cattle ranch." "State your business, Mr. Aldgate," Mara replied. "My business is practicality," he said. He reached into his coat again. He didn't pull out a document. He pulled out a thick, banded stack of money. "I did my research. You're Mara Voss. You were a waitress in Miles City 6 months ago. You have no family, no ties here. You are just hired help." He set the stack of money on the wooden railing. "That is $1,000, Aldgate said softly. "More money than a waitress makes in a lifetime. I need to see Mr. Dunn's ledgers. I need to know his operating capital. Just leave the office door unlocked tonight. Take the money, get on a train, go back east, start a real life." Mara looked at the money. It was a fortune. It was a ticket to anywhere in the world. She looked back at Aldgate. She didn't feel tempted. She felt disgusted. "Mr. Aldgate," Mara said. Her voice was steady, ringing clear across the yard. I want you to listen to me very carefully, because you seem to suffer from a profound lack of education regarding human nature." Aldgate frowned. "You wear an expensive suit. You speak with a polished accent. You call yourself a civilized man," Mara stated, delivering the lesson with absolute, unyielding clarity. "But exploiting others in the name of progress does not make you civilized. It makes you an educated savage. You believe that because people are poor, they have no morals. You believe that money is the only measure of a person's worth." She picked up the stack of money. "Integrity is not a commodity, Mr. Aldgate," Mara continued, her voice rising with fierce conviction. "Honor cannot be bought, and loyalty is not for sale. Do not try to price my integrity. I stand on the side of what is right. I stand with people who build their lives with their own hands, not those who steal it with fountain pens. That makes me priceless, and it makes you completely bankrupt." She tossed the money. It hit Aldgate squarely in the chest and scattered into the mud at his feet. "Get off this ranch," Mara said, "before I have Mr. Dunn throw you off." Aldgate looked at the money in the mud. He looked at Mara. His face was pale with fury. He didn't say a word. He bent down, picked up his dirty bills, and walked back to his buggy. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more meaningful stories. Summer arrived like an open oven door. The heat was brutal. It baked the mud into cracked ceramic. The prairie grass turned yellow, then brown. The wind didn't cool anything down. It just moved the hot dust around. Every morning the taste of dry dirt coated their teeth. Then the worst happened. The windmill stopped pumping. Callum primed the pump. He worked the heavy iron handle for an hour, nothing but a wheezing sigh of hot air. The main well had gone dry. The water table had dropped too low. Without water, the fortress was just a stone tomb. The cattle would die in a week. They would follow in 2. "We dig," Callum said. He didn't panic. He just grabbed a pickaxe. They picked a spot closer to the creek bed. Callum swung the pick. Hour after hour. Theo hauled the loose dirt away in heavy wooden buckets. The Montana sun beat down on them mercilessly. Callum's shirt was soaked. His hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. Mara brought them boiled water and salt pork. She watched Callum work. He didn't complain. He just drove the steel into the earth, rhythmic, relentless. By the 3rd day, they were 20 feet down. Mara was lowering a bucket on a rope. The hole was dark. Suddenly, Callum stopped swinging. The rhythmic thwack of steel on dirt was replaced by a sharp, metallic clink. "Callum?" Mara called down. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer. A minute later, he tugged the rope. "Pull the bucket up," he shouted. His voice echoed strangely in the shaft. Mara hauled it up. It was heavy, too heavy for loose dirt. She pulled it over the edge. She reached inside. It wasn't mud. It was chunks of rock, quartz, and running right through the center of the pale stone were thick, heavy veins of dull yellow metal. Mara stared at it. She forgot how to breathe. She tasted the dust on her lips. It was metallic, bitter, gold. Callum climbed the rope. He pulled himself over the edge, chest heaving. He looked at the rocks in the bucket. He looked at Mara. The pieces fell into place. A sudden, terrifying clarity. "The railroad," Callum whispered. He wiped the sweat from his eyes. "They don't want the grazing land. They don't give a damn about laying tracks through that pasture." "They ran geological surveys last fall," Mara said. Her mind was racing, connecting the dots. They knew. Aldgate knew. They found the vein on the edge of the property line. They figured out it runs right under the house. The stakes hadn't just changed, they had exploded. This wasn't a fight over a cattle ranch anymore. This was a fight over millions of dollars. The kind of money that made men disappear in the night. The kind of money that bought judges, marshals, and politicians. Callum looked at the gold. Then he looked at his bloody hands. "They'll kill us for this," Callum said quietly. A simple statement of fact. Mara didn't panic. She didn't cry. The fire in her eyes just burned brighter. "Let them try," she said. She turned and walked straight back to the house. She didn't look at the gold again. She went straight to her standing desk. She pulled out fresh ink, heavy parchment. She opened 3 different leather-bound law books. She began to write. She didn't fight with a pickaxe. She didn't fight with a gun. She fought with ink, precedent, and an intellect sharper than any blade in the territory. She drafted a federal injunction. She cited the Mining Act of 1872. She cross-referenced the Homestead Improvements. She built a legal fortress on paper, walling off the railroad's claim with impenetrable legal logic. She worked straight through the night. The sun came up. It painted the office in pale gold light. Callum walked in. He held 2 cups of coffee. He set one down on her desk. He didn't interrupt her. He just stood back and watched her work. He watched her cross out a line, rewrite it. Her brow furrowed in deep concentration. Her hands were stained with black ink. She looked exhausted, and she looked magnificent. Callum stepped forward. "Mara, stop for a second," he said quietly. She paused. She looked up. The ink on her pen dripped onto the blotter. "I need to say something," Callum said. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared. "And I need you to hear it." Mara set the pen down. She gave him her full attention. "When I was building this ranch, I believed a very specific lie," Callum said. His voice was deep, steady, and filled with absolute conviction. He was delivering a truth he had learned the hard way. "I used to believe that men ruled this world," Callum stated clearly, making sure the educational value of his words hung in the air. "I thought this frontier was tamed by guns, muscle, and heavy bankrolls. I thought brutality was the only currency that mattered. That was the arrogance of a foolish man." He pointed at the thick stack of legal documents she had just written. "I was wrong," Callum declared. "Look at what you just did. This ranch isn't just mine anymore. Your mind protected it. You are fighting a war against a massive corporation, and you are winning it with a pen and your intellect." Mara listened, deeply moved by the absolute sincerity in his eyes. "The world does not move forward because of men with guns, Mara," Callum continued, his words a powerful testament to equality. "It moves forward because of the fierce intellect, the unyielding justice, and the moral courage of women like you. It is the female mind that brings order to the chaos. Any man who refuses to see a woman as his absolute equal is a blind fool walking in the dark. You are the brains of this operation, and you are the reason this world is worth living in." Mara felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent her life being told to be quiet, being told to serve, being told her mind was secondary to a man's pride. And here in the wildest part of the country, the hardest man she had ever met had just handed her the ultimate respect. She picked up her pen. She dipped it in the ink. She looked at him with a fierce, beautiful smile. "Then let's finish this," she said. Let's break them." August was a furnace. The Montana sun didn't shine. It beat down. It hammered the dry earth until the soil cracked open like a parched mouth. The prairie grass was dead, yellow and brittle. Every breath of wind felt like it was blowing straight out of an open stove. Inside the stone house, the air was heavy, still. Mara stood at her oak desk. She didn't sit. She couldn't. The tension in the room was too thick. She had her papers laid out, stacks of parchment, federal statutes, copies of the Homestead Act, the Mining Act of 1872. Her handwriting covered the pages in sharp black ink. Callum stood by the window. He was watching the long dirt road that led to the property line. He wore his heavy canvas work pants, a faded blue cotton shirt rolled up at the sleeves. He didn't wear his gun belt. It hung on the back of a wooden chair. He had made his choice. This fight wouldn't be won with lead. It would be won with ink. "They're coming," Callum said quietly. Mara looked up. She walked to the window. Far down the road, a cloud of pale dust was rising. It was moving fast, too fast for a casual visit. It wasn't just a buggy this time. It was a procession. Mara walked back to the desk. She gathered her papers. She placed them in a thick leather folio. She tied the string. Her hands didn't shake. Her mind was a fortress. She had built the walls herself, brick by legal brick. Callum turned from the window. He looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. He knew she hadn't slept in 3 days. He also saw the absolute unbroken iron in her posture. "Are you ready?" Callum asked. "I am," Mara said. They walked out onto the front porch together. The heat hit them immediately. The dust cloud resolved into shapes. A black buggy in the lead. Behind it, 5 men on horseback. The buggy pulled to a halt right in front of the steps. The horses were lathered in white sweat. They had been pushed hard. Harrison Aldgate stepped out. He wore a light linen suit today. He still looked polished. He still looked deadly. But he wasn't alone. An older man stepped down after him. He wore a heavy black coat despite the suffocating heat. He had a silver pocket watch chain draped across his vest. His face was deeply lined, set in a permanent scowl of authority. This was Judge Silas Thorne, a federal circuit judge known for being deep in the railroad's pockets. Behind them, the riders dismounted. One of them wore a silver star pinned to his vest, U.S. Marshal Dan Hollis. A good man, usually, but a man bound by orders. The other 4 were deputies, hands resting casually near their holsters. This was an eviction posse. They had come to take the gold. Aldgate looked up at the porch. He didn't smile this time. "Mr. Dunn," Aldgate said, "this is Judge Thorne and Marshal Hollis. We are not here to survey today. We are here to execute a federal order of eviction." Callum stood at the top of the steps. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the gun he wasn't wearing. "On what grounds?" Callum asked. His voice was calm, steady. Judge Thorne stepped forward. He pulled a rolled document from his coat. He looked at Callum with absolute disdain. "On the grounds that your homestead claim is fraudulent, Mr. Dunn," Judge Thorne barked. His voice was like grinding stones. "You filed under agricultural improvements, but this land sits on a massive mineral deposit. The Northern Pacific Railroad holds a superior charter for mineral extraction in this corridor. The federal government has invalidated your deed. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises." Callum didn't move. He just looked at Mara. Mara stepped forward. She carried her leather folio. She walked to the top of the stairs, looking down at the judge. "Your Honor," Mara said smoothly. "May I see the order?" Judge Thorne blinked. He looked at her. He saw a woman in a faded cotton dress, a waitress from Miles City, a nobody. His face flushed with sudden sharp anger. "I don't hand federal documents to hired help, girl," Thorne snapped. "Go back to the kitchen and pack your employer's bags. The men are talking business." Aldgate smirked. He adjusted his cuffs. "I warned you, Mr. Dunn. You should have taken my advice. Now tell your woman to step aside. We are taking possession of the property." The silence on the porch was absolute. The cicadas in the dry grass stopped buzzing. A year ago, Callum Dunn would have drawn a gun. He would have started a war he couldn't win. He would have let his pride burn everything to the ground, but the arrogant cowboy was dead. The man standing on the porch was something entirely different. Callum took a slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the marshal. He walked right up to the edge of the stairs. He placed himself squarely beside Mara, shoulder to shoulder. When he spoke, his voice wasn't a roar. It was a deep, resonant thunder. "You are dead wrong, Aldgate," Callum said. The words echoed across the hot, dusty yard. He turned his gaze to Judge Thorne. His eyes were like chipped flint. "You tell her to go to the kitchen," Callum stated, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable clarity. "You dismiss her because she wears a dress. I want to make sure everyone in this yard hears me clearly right now." Callum pointed to Mara. "This woman is not just my employee," Callum declared. "She is my legal representative. She is my equal. She is the brains of this entire operation, and she holds half the deed to this land." Judge Thorne's mouth opened slightly. The deputies shifted uncomfortably. "Any law that denies a human being's right to speak simply because of their gender is a coward's law," Callum continued. He was speaking to the judge, but he was educating every man standing in the dirt. "You wear a black robe and call yourself a man of justice, But dismissing a brilliant mind because it belongs to a woman doesn't make you powerful. It makes you weak. It makes you a relic. Callum didn't stop. The fire inside him was entirely cold, entirely controlled. "True equality is not a favor you grant," Callum said, his words hammering the educational truth home. "It is a fundamental human right. Women build this frontier right alongside us. They bleed in this dirt. They starve in these winters, and they have every right to stand on the porch and fight for their homes. You will not disrespect her. You will look her in the eye. You will listen to her legal arguments, or you will have to step over my dead body to take 1 inch of this land." Nobody breathed. The words hung in the suffocating heat. Undeniable. Unbreakable. Marshal Hollis slowly took his hand off his gun belt. He looked at Callum. He looked at Mara. A profound look of respect crossed the lawman's face. Judge Thorne turned a deep, ugly shade of red. But he didn't argue. He couldn't. He practically shoved the rolled order toward Mara. Mara took it. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She untied the folio. She pulled out a stack of heavily annotated papers. "Thank you, Your Honor," Mara said smoothly. She unrolled his order. She glanced at it. She shook her head. "This eviction notice is dated August 12th, Mara stated. Her voice was crisp, professional. "And it cites the Railroad Charter of 1881 as the superior claim. However, you are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of the Mining Act of 1872. She handed Judge Thorne her first document. "Under Section 2320 of the revised statutes," Mara continued, pacing the porch like it was a federal courtroom, "a mineral claim cannot invalidate an existing agricultural homestead if the agricultural improvements were made and filed before the mineral discovery was publicly recorded. Mr. Dunn filed his agricultural deed in 1879. The railroad did not incorporate in this territory until 1881. Aldgate stepped forward. "That doesn't matter. The gold is in the bedrock. The railroad owns the subsurface rights under the Pacific Act." "Wrong again, Mr. Aldgate," Mara said. She handed him the second document. "I wired the General Land Office in Washington 3 weeks ago," Mara explained, "using the telegraph office in Miles City. I filed a preemptive mineral discovery addendum to our original homestead deed. I paid the required $5 filing fee. I have the telegraph receipt right there. We legally claimed the subsurface rights before you filed this eviction notice." Aldgate stared at the receipt. His hands began to shake slightly. "Furthermore," Mara said, her voice rising, driving the final nail into the coffin, "I have filed an injunction with the Federal Appellate Court in St. Paul, accusing the Northern Pacific Railroad of attempting to execute a fraudulent eviction using an administrative judge with known financial ties to the corporation." She looked directly at Judge Thorne. "If you attempt to execute this order today," Mara said softly, but loud enough for the deputies to hear, "you will not only be acting outside your jurisdiction, you will be acting in direct violation of a pending federal appellate review. I imagine the Senate Judiciary Committee would be very interested to know why you are acting as a private enforcer for Mr. Aldgate." Judge Thorne stared at the paper in his hands. He looked at the telegraph receipt. He looked at the woman in the faded dress. He had been beaten. Thoroughly. Completely. By a waitress. Thorne turned to Marshal Hollis. "Marshal," Thorne ground out between his teeth, "we are leaving." "Judge," Aldgate protested, "we have the men. We can take the property." "Are you deaf, Aldgate?" Thorne snarled, turning his fury on the railroad agent. "She filed an appellate injunction in St. Paul. If Hollis moves on this ranch, it's a federal crime. I am not losing my judgeship over your botched surveying operation. Get in the buggy." Aldgate stood in the dirt. He looked up at the porch. Callum was standing there, tall, immovable, and beside him stood Mara, the woman who couldn't be bought, the woman who had just brought a multi-million-dollar corporation to its knees with nothing but a pen and the truth. Aldgate didn't say another word. He climbed into the buggy. The procession turned around in the yard. The horses kicked up a fresh cloud of dust. They drove back down the long dirt road, back toward town. Mara stood on the porch until the dust settled. She slowly exhaled. Her legs suddenly felt like water. She reached out and gripped the wooden railing to steady herself. Callum stepped closer. He didn't say anything. He just placed his large, warm hand over hers on the railing. They had won the battle, but the heat was still rising, and the gold was still in the ground. Late August. The air tasted like copper. It was the kind of heat that made animals act strange. The horses paced their stalls. The cattle huddled in the dry creek bed, lowing constantly. The sky wasn't blue anymore. It was a hazy, sickly yellow. Mara sat on the porch step. She was wiping sweat from her forehead with a damp cloth. Theo was asleep on a blanket near the door. Callum was at the well, pulling up a bucket of water. Then the sky cracked open. There was no thunder, no warning, just a blinding, jagged flash of pure white light. It struck the eastern ridge, right near the boundary line, right near the old forbidden foundation. Mara jumped to her feet. Dry lightning, the terror of the plains. Before the echo of the strike faded, the smoke began to rise. Thick, black, angry. "Fire!" Callum roared. He dropped the bucket. He ran toward the barn. "Mara, wake the boy! Get the burlap sacks! Soak them in the horse troughs!" Mara shook Theo awake. The boy's eyes went wide. He didn't panic. He had survived the blizzard. He knew how to move. They ran to the water troughs. They plunged heavy, coarse burlap feed sacks into the water. They hauled the dripping sacks toward the eastern ridge. When they crested the hill, Mara stopped. Her heart slammed against her ribs. It wasn't a brush fire. It was an inferno. The dead prairie grass was exploding into flame. A solid wall of fire 30 feet high was rolling down the ridge. It was moving straight toward the hollow, straight toward the new well, straight toward the barn and the house. The heat was a physical blow. It singed the hair on Mara's arms from 50 yards away. Callum was already down in the hollow. He was swinging a wet sack, beating at the advancing flames, trying to cut a fire line. It was useless. He was one man fighting the end of the world. "Callum!" Mara screamed. "Get back! It's too fast!" He couldn't hear her over the roar of the fire. The sound was deafening, like 100 locomotives rushing through the valley. Mara and Theo ran down into the heat. They started swinging their wet sacks, beating the burning grass. Searing sparks flew into their faces. Smoke blinded them. They choked on the ash. For 20 minutes it was absolute hell. The fire crested the lip of the hollow. It began to burn the roots of the dead cottonwood trees. "We can't hold it," Callum yelled, pulling Mara back by her apron strings. "The barn! We have to save the barn!" They retreated. The fire swallowed the hollow. It swallowed the new well. They stood near the barn, beating at the sparks that rained down on the dry cedar roof. The smoke was so thick it turned the midday sun into a dim, bloody red disk. They were losing. Their arms were heavy. The sacks were drying out. Then the ground began to shake. It wasn't the fire. It was hooves, dozens of them. Through the thick black smoke, riders appeared, like phantoms riding out of the apocalypse. It was Chief Standing Bear. He rode a painted Mustang. Behind him were 20 young men from the reservation. They didn't have wet sacks. They had heavy shovels and thick, raw hides. They didn't hesitate. They didn't ask for permission. They threw themselves off their horses. They formed a line. They began digging a massive trench between the advancing fire and the barn. They threw dirt onto the flames. They smothered the sparks with the heavy hides. Callum stared through the smoke. He saw the very people he had betrayed, the people he had helped starve, throwing themselves into the fire to save his home. He didn't freeze. He grabbed his shovel. He ran to the line. He dug right beside them, shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating heat. They fought for 3 hours. They dug, they smothered, they bled, they choked. Finally, the wind shifted. The fire hit the trench. It couldn't jump the dirt. It crawled along the edge, starved for fuel, and slowly began to die out. The roar faded to a hiss, then to a crackle. It was over. Callum dropped his shovel. He fell to his knees in the ash. He was covered in soot. His hands were burned. He couldn't breathe. Mara collapsed beside him. Theo was curled up by the water trough, safe, exhausted. Standing Bear walked over. His face was streaked with black ash. He looked at the barn. It was singed but standing. The stone house was untouched. Callum looked up at the chief. He couldn't speak. His throat was raw. Standing Bear nodded once. Then he pointed his shovel toward the eastern ridge. "Look," the chief said. Callum turned. He looked through the thinning smoke. The fire had burned away all the vegetation holding the ridge together. The intense heat had cracked the dry earth. With a low, grinding rumble that shook the bones of the earth, the ridge gave way. A massive landslide of mud, rock, and bedrock tore loose. It slid down into the hollow. It buried the old foundation. It buried the bones. And it buried the new well. Millions of tons of solid rock crashed down, sealing the hollow forever. The gold was gone, buried under a mountain that no man could dig through. Callum stared at the massive pile of rubble. The fortune, the wealth, the millions of dollars that Aldgate had wanted, all of it erased by the earth. He looked at the rubble. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel cheated. He felt free. The next morning, the smoke had cleared. The sky was pale and quiet. The smell of burnt pine hung heavy in the air. Harrison Aldgate arrived in his buggy. He didn't bring the judge. He didn't bring the marshal. He stood at the edge of the landslide. He looked at the millions of tons of bedrock sitting on top of his gold mine. He did the math in his head. The cost of excavation, the time, the sheer impossibility of it. He turned around. He looked at Callum standing on the porch. Aldgate didn't say a word. He climbed into his buggy, turned the horse around, and drove away. He would never return. Callum walked down the steps. He walked out into the blackened, ashen fields. He walked toward the remains of the cottonwood grove. Chief Standing Bear was waiting there. He was sitting on a charred stump, watching the sun rise over the ruined land. Callum walked up to him. He didn't stand tall. He took his hat off. "You saved my home," Callum said. His voice was hoarse. Standing Bear looked at the ashes. "The fire does not choose what it burns. We choose what we save." Callum swallowed hard. He looked at the man he had wronged so deeply. "I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness," Callum said. He didn't offer money. He didn't make excuses. He spoke from the deepest, rawest part of his soul. He spoke the absolute truth. "I understand now," Callum stated, his voice carrying the profound educational weight of his journey. "I spent my life believing that wealth made a man superior. I thought I could buy away my sins, but I was wrong. All men are created equal. The color of our skin, the money in our pockets, none of it changes our fundamental worth. You have a right to live in peace on the land of your ancestors. You have a right to your dignity. My people tried to steal that from you, and I was part of it." Standing Bear listened. His dark eyes were unreadable. "I cannot change the past," Callum continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my breathing days using this land to ensure your people have a sanctuary. The eastern pastures are yours. The water is yours. True redemption isn't just feeling guilty. True redemption is fighting to protect the people you once failed. I promise you that protection." Standing Bear stood up. He looked at Callum. He looked past the soot, past the burns, right into the man's heart. "The earth demands a heavy price for the truth," Standing Bear said softly. He reached out. He placed his weathered hand on Callum's shoulder. "The fire burned away your arrogance, Dunn," Standing Bear said, his voice ringing with quiet, ancient authority. "It burned away the coward who hid behind his gold. Today, you have finally stopped hiding. Today, you finally become a man." Callum closed his eyes. A single, clean tear cut a path through the dark soot on his face. He nodded. He turned and looked back at the house. The barn was black, the fields were ash, the gold was gone. He was, by all accounts, a poor man again. But as he saw Mara walking down the porch steps, holding Theo's hand, bringing out a fresh pot of coffee, Callum Dunn knew he was the wealthiest man in the world. It was late September. A full year had passed. The Montana air was crisp. The kind of cold that wakes you up, not the kind that kills. The sky was a brilliant, bruised blue. The Dunn Ranch was different now. It wasn't a fortress anymore. The aggressive lines of barbed wire near the eastern ridge were gone. Callum had pulled them down himself with a pair of heavy leather gloves and a team of horses. The land where the old foundation used to be was now a gentle, sloping hill. The earth had healed. Chief Standing Bear's people had set up a winter camp on the far side of Powder Creek. Their horses grazed freely on Callum's grass. There were no fences between them, just an understanding. The gold was still buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock. It was going to stay there. Mara stood on the front porch. She held a steaming cup of coffee. She watched Callum and Theo out in the corral. They were breaking a new Mustang, a stubborn, beautiful roan. Callum wasn't yelling. He wasn't using the whip. He was using patience. He showed Theo how to stand his ground, how to breathe, how to let the animal learn to trust the man. It took an hour, but the horse finally lowered its head. It nudged Callum's shoulder. Theo beamed, a real, honest smile. He wasn't a frightened orphan anymore. He was a ranch hand. He was family. Callum patted the horse's neck. He looked up toward the porch. He saw Mara. He didn't give a cocky smirk. He gave a quiet, genuine nod. He walked up to the house. He wiped his boots on the mat. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood next to her. "The herd is fat," Callum said softly. "The grass held out. We'll have enough to pay the winter hands and buy supplies for the creek camp." "We aren't rich," Mara noted. "No," Callum agreed. "We aren't." He turned to look at her. "I need you in the office. There is one last piece of paperwork from the surveyor's office in Helena." Mara followed him inside. The new oak standing desk was exactly where it had been all winter. The ledgers were neat. The war with the railroad was a distant memory. Aldgate had never returned. Callum walked over to his own desk. He pulled a heavy, official-looking document from the top drawer. It had a gold wax seal from the territorial governor's office. He placed it flat on Mara's desk. He handed her a fountain pen. "Read it," Callum said. Mara looked down. It was the master deed to the ranch. The final uncontested title updated after the landslide and the new property surveys. She read the first paragraph. She stopped. She read it again. Her heart gave a heavy, sudden thump against her ribs. Under the section marked Property Ownership, there weren't just Callum's initials. It read, Callum J. Dunn and Mara Elspeth Voss. Joint tenants in common. Equal share. Mara slowly set the pen down. She looked at Callum. 50%, Mara whispered. She couldn't quite believe it. "Callum, in this territory, a woman can't even vote. Most banks won't let a woman open an account without a husband's signature. You're giving me half of a cattle empire." Callum shook his head. He stepped closer. "I am not giving you anything," Callum said firmly. His voice was absolute. "I am recognizing what is already a fact." Mara looked back at the paper. The black ink was permanent. "I want to be perfectly clear about this," Callum continued, ensuring the profound educational truth of the moment hung in the quiet room. "A society that halves its strength by suppressing the rights of women is a society that deserves to fail. You didn't just keep the books, Mara. You saved this land. You fought off a federal judge with your intellect. You stood in the fire alongside me. You are my equal in every single way." He tapped the deed with his finger. "True equality isn't a favor a man grants to a woman," Callum stated, his eyes locked on hers. "It is a fundamental human right. You earned this. Your mind and your courage are the foundation of this ranch. I will not live out my days pretending I built this alone. Sign the paper, Mara. Make the law recognize what the truth already is." Mara felt a warm tear trace down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She had spent her entire life navigating a world that told her she was secondary. A world that told her a woman's only value was in her silence and her service. She picked up the fountain pen. Her hand didn't shake. She signed her name, bold, clear, right next to his. "There," Mara said softly. "It's official." "Good," Callum said. A slow, deeply contented smile spread across his face. "Now go pack a bag. We have to go to town." The ride into Miles City took 4 hours. The town hadn't changed much. It was still loud, still dusty, still filled with men trying to dig a fortune out of the dirt or steal it from someone who already had. But Callum and Mara had changed. Callum drove the wagon down Main Street. He didn't sit rigid and tense. He sat relaxed. He didn't look at the town with disdain. He looked at it with the quiet peace of a man who no longer had anything to prove. Mara sat beside him. She wore a simple wool jacket. She didn't look like a tired waitress. She looked like exactly what she was: a landowner, a partner, a woman who knew her own absolute worth. Callum parked the wagon in front of a familiar building, the Silver Dollar Saloon. Mara looked at the faded wooden sign. She looked at Callum. "We need supplies from the mercantile," Mara said, raising an eyebrow. "Not whiskey." "Indulge me," Callum said softly. He stepped down from the wagon. He walked around to her side. He didn't turn his back and walk away like he had a year ago. He reached up. He offered his hand. Mara took it. She stepped down. His grip was warm, strong, safe. They walked through the swinging doors together. It was mid-afternoon. The saloon wasn't packed, but it was busy. The same piano player was tapping out a tired tune in the corner. The air still smelled like stale beer and sawdust. The bartender looked up. He froze. He recognized Callum immediately, the wealthy cattle baron. But he also recognized Mara. He stared at her, his jaw slightly slack, trying to reconcile the woman in the fine wool jacket with the exhausted girl who used to wipe down his tables for pennies. Callum didn't order a drink. He guided Mara to the far end of the long mahogany bar, to a quiet corner booth, the exact booth where he had sat 1 year ago. They stood facing each other. The noise of the saloon seemed to fade away. Callum looked at the scarred wood of the table. Then he looked up into Mara's eyes. He took his hat off. "1 year ago I sat right here," Callum said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble. "I was carrying the weight of a terrible sin. I was drowning in my own arrogance. I threw a stack of money on this table." Mara smiled softly. "I remember. You were the most infuriating man I had ever met." "I was a fool," Callum said. He didn't look away. "I looked at you, and I asked you what your price was." Mara held his gaze. The memory of that night was burned into both of their souls. "It was the most foolish question I have ever asked in my life," Callum continued. His voice was thick with emotion. "But the answer you gave me, it changed the entire course of my existence." Callum reached out. He gently took both of her hands in his. "You taught me the most important lesson a man can learn," Callum said, his words ringing with absolute, undeniable clarity. "You taught me that a human soul is never an item for sale. You taught me that money can buy land, and it can buy silence. But it can never buy human dignity, and it can never buy forgiveness." Mara squeezed his hands. Her heart swelled with a fierce, quiet joy. "You listened, Callum," Mara said gently. "That is the difference. So many men in this world hear the truth, but they refuse to listen. You let the truth break you open, and then you rebuilt yourself into a better man." Callum shook his head slightly. "We rebuilt it, together." He lifted her hand. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. It wasn't a gesture of ownership. It was a gesture of profound reverence. "Do you know the answer now, Callum Dunn?" Mara asked softly, a playful light dancing in her eyes. "Do you know my price?" Callum smiled. It reached all the way to his eyes. "I do," he said. "You are priceless. Your intellect, your courage, your dignity, they cannot be bought with all the gold buried under Montana. We don't buy each other, Mara. We belong to each other." Mara stepped closer. The noise of the saloon didn't matter. The dust of the town didn't matter. "Yes," Mara whispered. "We do." She leaned in. Their lips met. It wasn't a rushed, desperate kiss. It was deep, steady. It held the weight of the blizzard they had survived, the heat of the fire they had fought, the quiet strength of the land they had saved. It was the kiss of two absolute equals. When they pulled away, Callum put his hat back on. He offered his arm. Mara looped her arm through his. They turned and walked out of the Silver Dollar Saloon. They pushed through the swinging doors and stepped out into the bright golden afternoon sun. They didn't look back. The history of the West is usually written in blood and gold. It is a story told by men who believed that the land belonged to whoever had the sharpest gun and the deepest pockets. But the land doesn't care about gold. The land doesn't care about the lines men draw on maps. The Dunn Ranch thrived. It never produced a single ounce of gold. But it produced something far more valuable. It produced a legacy. Callum and Mara Dunn lived on that land for another 40 years. They turned the Eastern Ridge over to Chief Standing Bear's people permanently, drafting an ironclad legal trust that no federal court could ever break. They proved that historical wrongs cannot be erased, but they can be answered with unyielding, present-day justice. They built a schoolhouse near the creek. Mara taught there. She taught the ranch hands. She taught the indigenous children. She taught them how to read the laws that govern their lives. She taught them that a sharp mind is the only weapon that never runs out of ammunition. And most importantly, they taught a generation of children the very lesson that was forged in the fire of their own lives. An arrogant man who used wealth to hide from his pain learned that his only true salvation lay in compassion and accountability. And a destitute waitress, through sheer, unbreakable conviction, reminded a wild, violent frontier of a timeless educational truth. They taught the world that you cannot put a price tag on a human being. That true power is not found in dominating others, but in lifting them up to stand as your equals. Money is just paper. Gold is just rock. But human dignity, once claimed and fiercely defended, is absolute. It is the one thing in this world that is truly, entirely, and forever not for sale. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances. The dust settles differently after a story like this, not because the land has changed, but because the people standing on it have. In the end, Callum Dunn did not win because he was the richest man, nor because he was the strongest. He won because he learned, he listened, he changed. And in the unforgiving world of the frontier, that may be the rarest victory of all. What this story leaves behind is not just the image of a hardened cowboy softened by truth, or a fearless woman standing her ground in a world that tried to silence her. It leaves us with something deeper, something that lingers long after the fire burns out and the gold is buried beneath the earth. It reminds us that dignity is not something given by society, nor granted by power. It is something we carry within ourselves, something that cannot be bought, traded, or taken, only honored or denied. Mara Voss stood as proof that intellect, courage, and self-respect can reshape even the most rigid world. She did not fight with weapons, but with clarity, not with force, but with truth. And through her, we are reminded that real strength is not loud, not violent, not controlling. It is steady, unwavering, and rooted in principle. And Callum? His journey is perhaps the most human of all, because it is easy to judge a man for his past, but far harder to acknowledge the courage it takes to confront it. He teaches us that guilt alone is not redemption. Suffering in silence does not heal the wounds we have caused. True redemption demands action. It demands that we stand up, speak out, and use whatever power we have to make things right, not just for ourselves, but for others. This story also speaks to something timeless, the idea of equality, not as a concept written on paper, but as something lived, practiced, and proven through actions. In a world that tried to define worth by gender, wealth, or status, it shows us clearly a person's value lies in their character, their choices, and their willingness to stand for what is right. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of this: true wealth has nothing to do with gold buried in the ground or money stacked in a bank. True wealth is found in connection, in compassion, in the quiet moments where we choose to care for someone else, to protect, to forgive, to grow. So as this story comes to a close, we are left with a simple but powerful truth. No matter where we come from, no matter what we've done, we always have a choice: to remain who we were or to become something better. And sometimes, that choice is worth more than all the gold in the West.